My life has always been entrenched in formal education. When I was a young girl, my grandmother, she would always rewrite our speeches around Easter. And they were always very poetic. In fact, my grandmother didn't think it was a poem unless it was rhyming. And so, it was during, memorizing and reciting the poems that my grandmother wrote for me that I think I became aware of the rhythm of language.
As a kid, I was always a reader. One of the great things about studying literature is it takes you out of yourself. It brings you into dialogue not only with great writers across history, but with other communities of readers. You're reading the same thing that people have read for 2,000 years.
There's nothing more fun than talking about Machiavelli.
That's an extraordinary feeling, and I think I was hooked on that fairly early on.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about migration pathways. My entire undergrad degree was in marine biology, and I was convinced I was going to be a marine biologist. And then I decided I'd go on to graduate school, and a PhD came my way that was on a group of birds called sunbirds, which are from Africa, that I was fascinated in. And I did that, and I've never looked back since.
Boundary condition in the middle, those people
Right.
are...
I was in grad school, and I saw what a professor's job was, but I didn't necessarily want to run a lab. But I liked part of it. I liked the teaching part.
We're interested in the X balance, so that's why we've drawn it this way.
Then I moved here for a full-time position in bioengineering.
I used to teach preschool, and I do think it informs my teaching. I really like to connect to each person. It's something you learn to do with 3-year-olds. They're very unique, each one.
We see Charles LeBrun pointing to what art should do.
And that assumption that everybody has something to give and deserves to be here is something I probably also learned in preschool.
My first lecture was a disaster. I was demonstrating some code, and it was supposed to loop and then spit out 16, and I had written it incorrectly, so it spit out 32. So I basically said, and as you can see, running the software, it adds up to 16, and then the hands start coming up. And I'm like, oh yes, and I get to turn. Oh. Yeah, it would have done that had I correctly programmed it.
I still remember the first graduate seminar I taught at Berkeley. I started to give a presentation, and I got a few minutes into it, and hands started going up, and they started challenging me, and they kind of started ganging up at a certain point, and I thought, this is it. This is a real university. And I still remember that sense of exhilaration of knowing that whatever I said was going to be tested and challenged in some way by the students.
I was a graduate student when I gave my first lecture. The last little piece that we need to think about is, why do birds sing? And so I was extremely nervous to give this lecture. So I started lecturing, but my heart was pounding, and in my head, I knew I was speaking too fast. And then I was fortunate because about 5 minutes into the lecture, one of the students asked a really engaging question that sort of stopped me, and I had to really think about it. And then in answering that question, I realized, wow, this is actually going to be a two-way interaction between me and the students. It's not just me having to stand up here. And I think with that realization, I sort of relaxed, and the whole process became a lot easier after that.
Remember, we were underscoring King and his nonviolent movement. UC Berkeley students are incredibly engaging. I think many of them have had experiences prior to coming to Cal where they shined in high school, perhaps they shined at their junior colleges, and so everybody is ready to shine in the classroom. And so it's easy to get a rhythm of conversation. And I think it's through the rhythm of conversation that people learn from one another. I learn from them, and it's where I think true learning happens.
I love it when a student asks me a question I'm completely unprepared for, and I need to pause and consider and figure out how to do it. It's just, as a personal challenge, that's fun.
It's extremely important in the classroom, it seems to me, to create a safe environment in which students feel that they can take risks. And one of the ways in which I can do that is by making it clear to them that I'm on a voyage of discovery myself.
I show some portraits of young Italian men in my introductory survey. Suddenly, one year, people started to laugh as a group at the portrait, and I said, I know he's coy and beautiful, but why are you laughing so hard? And it turns out he had his fingers in the formation of a kind of gangster code. And they were like, he's gangsta, you know?
By geometry, I can say that this distance.
I find Berkeley students to be very well-rounded. I'm impressed that you have people that are in a very challenging major, but have really interesting things going on in their life. You know, people that email me and say, I might be in the Olympics. I was wondering if I can, you know, be sure to get in your class an extra, you know, semester later. I'm not going to stand in the way of your Olympic hopes.
Diversity helps to remind us that there is a big world around us. We're living in Berkeley, we're attending Cal, and oftentimes it can almost feel like we're living in a bubble. If there is not diversity in the classroom, we lose out on so many different voices. We lose out on so many different ways of thinking about very critical questions. And more importantly, I think we lose out on the possibility of truly learning about one another.
When I first came here, teaching a work by a 17th century classical French playwright to a young man of Filipino-American descent who said, this play is about my grandparents. It's about family honor, it's about inheritance. This is my story. And to have that experience of a student who takes something away from a text and applies it to his own life and reads his own life in that work of literature, that's something that the students at Berkeley demonstrate again and again for me. And it's really an invigorating experience.
Sometimes you'll see more complicated systems.
I am definitely a nerd.
Questions?
I think that in our culture, showing enthusiasm for science is a little suspect. So if I can be somebody that stands up and waves my arms around, gesticulates wildly while they're lecturing, and is shameless in how interested I personally am in the material that we're working with, I think that that alone has value.
Going out in nature is what really makes the course what it is. Students will always be able to go and look up the facts. My ultimate goal is if I can teach them to think critically and I can impart an appreciation of the natural world, I've done well.
I want you to be able to contextualize their experiences.
I think for me, one of the best ways in which to create a classroom where people feel safe to share who they are is because I share who I am.
Very few women were allowed into the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. They allow 4.
I'm always telling students you can't go into a museum and expect to care about a lot of things you know nothing about. You know, some will strike you, but most won't. And that's why you have to do the work of finding out something about that art, that history. And then you're alert to what the stakes are.
I've really, over the years, come to believe that you can make a difference. And so there's nothing more rewarding than going to commencement and seeing the pride that students have in introducing their professor to their parents, or once they've graduated, out of the blue, knocking on my office door and saying, because of your course, I've fallen in love with birds and I've decided to go to graduate school. Those are awards that are just, I treasure every aspect of them. They're truly amazing. They're so fulfilling.